Okay, I think we can get started. Welcome everybody to the Transit Network Redesign Public Meeting Alternatives Report. I'm Mike Chekvala from City of Madison and Metro Transit. So thank you for coming. Our basic goal here is to design a better route network that serves Madison's and the Madison area's residents, businesses, and visitors better than the current system does. We're glad to have you all here tonight. Your input is vital to this process. We would like this process to be a collaborative process that results in something that's better. And so your input is necessary for that. We also have Jarrett Walker, an internationally renowned transit planning firm, Jarrett Walker and Associates, helping city staff to design the new network. So with that, if Mayor Sacha Rose Conway is online, we can start things off with an introduction from her.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks everybody for being here tonight. I really appreciate your engagement in this critical and hopefully transformational transit network redesign. This really is our opportunity to make a generational change in our transit system. Our transit system has been through a few of these. If you go way back, think about when Madison first got electric streetcars, or when that streetcar era ended in the 30s, or when the city of Madison took over Metro in the 70s, or even more recently, the transfer point redesign in the 90s. This is hopefully a change on that scale, and really an opportunity for us to step back, look at the whole system, and ask ourselves, how do we best serve a rapidly growing city? You know, the most recent census numbers really underscore the growth in our city and the needs for a more efficient transit system and a more efficient transportation system overall. So I think it's really important that we look at those data, that we look at the options that are before us, and have a debate and a dialogue over what will be best for Madison. So your voices are obviously really important in that debate and dialogue. And that's why we're asking folks tonight to participate, but also why we're asking people to look online and fill out the surveys and get your input in any way that is easiest for you. I am hopeful that we are on our way to Metro Transit Network redesign that serves Madison better and particularly more equitably than ever. So I invite you to help us by co-creating the new system, and to think about how we can build a network that best serves you, but also your neighbors and your neighborhood and the whole city. There are difficult choices for sure. You know, we've gone all the way down to the clean slate, and we're thinking about building back up again. And if you're a current bus rider, you probably have some emotional attachment to your own routes that you usually ride. I certainly do. And it's, I have to admit that I'm not adjusted to the fact that it's the 28 that comes to my bus stop and not the 27 anymore. But I'm going to ask you to put that aside a little bit. Certainly you want to think about how the system will serve you in the future. But maybe don't get hung up on a particular route number or a particular way of weaving through the neighborhood, and think more about the underlying principles of service, and what actually would be the best transit service for you, again, your family, your neighborhood, but also our whole city. And I ask you to keep, as always, equity as a guiding light here. It's certainly something that we at the city are keeping in the front of our minds as we think about changing services. And I invite you to also encourage folks in your circles to engage with this process so we can hear from as many voices as possible in Madison. we really do need to think about how we serve our entire city, but particularly our lower income neighborhoods, as those folks may be more dependent on transit than some of the rest of us. So keep that in mind as well as you're evaluating the options here. Of course, we can't talk about redesigning our transit network without mentioning Metro Rapid, our bus rapid transit system that we are working fairly quickly on to bring to Madison. This system, the network redesign is built on the assumption that we're going to have this backbone of really frequent rapid service to connect east to west and eventually north to south, bringing residents and visitors to all of the things that Madison has to offer. And so these two projects, the bus rapid transit and the transit network redesign, are separate, but they're interdependent. And they will work together to form a new system with BRT as the backbone and the rest of the network fleshing out service throughout the city. And that combination is what it's the level of service, the type of service that Madison deserves, that we need, and hopefully what we are designing here today with you. So thanks so much for being here, for participating, and for giving us your feedback on what you think Madison's transit system should look like now and into the future. Thanks, Mike, for the opportunity, and I really look forward to seeing the input that we get tonight.
Thank you, Mayor. If we can go to our agenda. Again, my name is Mike Czechvala. I'm the project manager for this project. We also have several other city staff that are tightly involved with the project. Tom Lynch, the Director of Transportation, Justin Sturenberg, the Metro Transit General Manager, as well as several other people that are key to the project here. Oh yeah, thank you. Sorry. We also have, we're fortunate to have consultants Jarrett Walker and Associates with Daniel Costantino and Chris Yuen. And we also have Melissa Huggins from Urban Assets. I'd just like to point out quickly before we get started that this meeting is being recorded, and we'll get a video recording of this meeting up on our website. That website, of course, being mymetrobus.com/redesign. With that, I will go ahead and hand things over to Daniel Costantino.
Thanks, Mike. Can you hear me? Great. My name's Daniel Costantino. I am a transit planner and project manager with Jarrett Walker and Associates. We are a small firm based in Portland, Oregon, focused entirely on helping cities and transit agencies design better service for their communities that meets their communities' goals. And I'll be presenting on the alternatives tonight. Before I start, I want to just give a quick reminder on meeting protocols here. I believe everyone in the attendee section is automatically on mute during the presentation, but please don't try to unmute yourself. There will be opportunities to speak after I'm done with the presentation and to ask any questions you may have. If you'd like to write your question down, you can use the chat to do that during the presentation. When I'm done with the presentation, you can raise your hand. And then when you are called, please introduce yourself before asking your question. And once you're done, please lower your hand. Melissa Huggins from Urban Assets will be helping me out with facilitating for that. So Mike already mentioned the team from the city that we have here. I am heading the consultant team. I'm with Jarrett Walker and Associates. I'm here with my colleague, Chris Yuen, who's leading our analysis, and with Melissa Huggins from Urban Assets in Madison. And now I should really get into the material here, which is really, what are we doing here today? Mayor Rhodes Conway mentioned that this is re-envisioning the network, and what this really comes down to is where and how often the bus runs. How often is the bus going to come and where is it going to go? And in thinking about this, we want to make sure that we do it in a way that's going to better serve your community's values and priorities. We have been in this process as a project team since last fall. And over the winter and the spring, we spent a few months researching existing conditions in Madison in general and the current operations of the transit network. And we actually went through a first phase of public input on some of the key high-level choices about transit back in March. We've taken what we heard then to develop 2 alternatives that we'll be presenting to you today and that we're currently gathering public input on through the end of the month, roughly. So why do we need this input? Well, obviously we need input because the reason we need input is that Metro Transit really faces a tricky trade-off about what to do with its bus service. And this trade-off isn't purely technical in nature. Whenever you make any changes to bus service, you are positively impacting some people and negatively impacting others. And so you have to think about what is going on there. And when you make really big structural changes, Metro Transit has to think about whether it should be focusing more on the kind of frequent and direct service that can be useful to as many people as possible, that gets the highest possible ridership, or whether they should be focusing more on having service available very nearby to as many people and places as possible, which gets as much coverage as possible. And Metro Transit can't do this alone because, technically speaking, we could design a ridership-oriented network or a coverage-oriented network. And in fact, we have, and you'll be able to see them. But which one you actually should do isn't a technical question. It's a question about your community's values. So how to provide input. Tonight, you can ask questions or provide comment after I'm done with this presentation. We also currently have a survey that's available online. You can find it by going to the project website at mymetrobus.com/redesign, or you can follow, if you are able to take notes quickly, the link that I have shown, the direct link I've shown below. Also, whether it's tonight, until next Tuesday or anytime, you can always email metroredesign@cityofmadison.com with any feedback you may have through the end of this project. So to get back to ridership and coverage and why those two things are a trade-off, I'd like to give you a quick fictional example of this town that you can see here on this slide. You can see some gray lines. Those are basically streets that you might be able to run buses on. And you can see a lot of little dots. And those are people and jobs who live in this town. And so I wanted you to put yourself in the position of Metro Transit. You have a certain number of buses. How are you going to run them in this town? Well, if your goal were to get the highest possible ridership, you would want to get the most useful service close to as many people as possible. And what you would end up doing is providing the highest possible frequency on the 2 main streets where there are many, many people nearby. That would mean that the service on those streets would be very direct and very convenient. But it would also mean there would be a whole lot of other parts of this town that you wouldn't be serving. And depending on the characteristics of the people that are far from service, you may not be covering some of the people who might need service most. Maybe if you were the transit planner and you showed this to your council, they would say, why don't you go to all these other neighborhoods? We should go to all the neighborhoods. Do that instead. And then you would design a network that meets the coverage goal. And when you design a network for coverage, you send buses, a few buses, in as many places as possible. And when you do that, you're spreading service out. When you spread service out, you spread it thin, so service is infrequent, which means it's not likely to be very useful for many people in trips. If you're wondering why that's not useful for many people in trips, it's worth thinking about the experience of a bus rider, waiting for a bus that only comes once an hour. If you're a driver, you may have the experience of having a car and having a driveway. Now imagine at the end of your driveway, there is a gate, and that gate only opens once an hour for about a minute at a time. And if you miss the moment when that gate opens, you can't go where you're going for another hour. That's what it's like to be trying to use transit that doesn't come very often. And so whenever people are thinking about how useful or how easy it is to use transit in their daily lives, that's highly affected by effectively how open that gate opens, how often the bus comes. So any transit agency has to balance ridership and coverage. There are very good reasons to plan for either goal. On the ridership side, you're obviously making service as useful for as many trips as possible. You're also reducing how much subsidy you need per passenger. You're also creating the maximum possible reduction in vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions. On the coverage side, providing service everywhere, even if it's not useful for most trips, means that everyone has basic insurance against isolation, no matter where they are, and that can be a very important consideration as well. Since these two things drive you to plan opposite kinds of service, the trade-off's unavoidable. And it's unavoidable at any level of funding, really. No matter how much funding for service you have to decide how much you're going to concentrate it and how much you're going to spread it out. So what does this mean for Madison? If we think about ridership, the most important thing is where people and the places they need to go are located. What you see now here is a map of the density of people and jobs in Madison. Where it's blue, you have a lot of people living. Where it's orange, you have a lot of jobs. And where it's kind of red or purple, you have a lot of people and a lot of jobs. And if you look at this, it's very obvious that the highest densities of people and jobs are really mostly located in the more central areas of Madison, kind of from the university campus through downtown, through the isthmus, and that there are lower densities elsewhere. So any transit network really focused on ridership is going to focus primarily on travel that's going to be convenient for people and jobs located downtown. This is further strengthened when you think about the people who might be using transit very often. So this is a map of zero vehicle households, households where nobody has a car. And these are very heavily concentrated in central parts of Madison. Now, that's all fine and good, but going back to coverage, yes, the highest densities of people, which you can see here, the residential density in Madison, are located in the center, but you can see that the rest of this map is also, fairly blue. There are people that live all over the city. And there are not just people living all over the city, there are places that they need to go all over the city. And so this is a map of the density of jobs. You can see, yes, the highest densities of jobs are nearing downtown, but there are a lot of jobs located far from downtown, including all around the Beltline. Mayor Rhodes Conway mentioned earlier the point on equity, and equity being a real driving force in this process. And we know that it's important to a lot of people in Madison. So you might want to think ridership and coverage. How does that matter? How does equity fit in here? Well, when we think about equity, we think about who might need transit more, who might need public services in general more. And one way to think about that is people who don't have as many resources as most other people might. So when we look at, this is right here, this is a map of people with low incomes, people whose incomes are below the poverty line. And you can see that although there are very high densities downtown, just reflecting the higher general population densities, but also the high student population downtown, which has relatively low incomes, there are also really important concentrations of low income people in outlying areas. And in a few specific areas in the north, the south, the southwest, the areas that are highlighted with red circles in this map. And what's interesting about these areas in these red circles is that they also happen to correspond to where a lot of Madison's communities of color are located. And so specifically the more disadvantaged communities of color, particularly Black and Latino and certain segments of the Asian population, are heavily concentrated in specific peripheral areas that are not central and that are in fact kind of hard to reach for from the perspective of a transit network. So that's the general shape of the problem. Now I'd like to present to you the alternatives that we've actually developed. Before I present them, I'll just let you know a couple of the basic rules we took into this process or were told to take into this process. This was developed collaboratively with Metro Transit staff as well as some staff from the MPO, the University of Wisconsin, and other bodies. So we worked on this together. I just want to make clear that this is not us consultants working on this in a corner and doing something for your city that's far away. We help everyone think about this, but this is really, this is a process that has been thought through by your people locally, and hopefully will now be thought through by you, and we'll get some of your input. So basic assumptions. First of all, we're assuming that the BRT Metro Rapid project is happening, and that's central to both alternatives. Secondly, we're assuming that service levels in total are going to go back to 2019 levels. If you use transit, you will have noticed that during the pandemic, service has been reduced considerably. And so this is really planning for a kind of post-pandemic world where service levels can go back to what they were in 2019, which but at the same time, the city doesn't have an unlimited budget. So that is related to the service budget that was available then and that we assume will be available in future. But that also means that any decision in these alternatives that makes service better in one place may make service worse in some other place because we're shifting resources around. And to address the point of shifting resources around specifically for BRT, I do want to make it clear that Metro Transit staff has done some analysis of this, and the BRT service hours in both alternatives are similar to the total hours spent in the BRT corridors in 2019. So we're not taking resources from elsewhere to fund BRT or vice versa. Because we're working on the 2019 operating budget, we also, neither alternative is going to significantly expand the scope of places the network goes in general. And we're also assuming that, as has always been the case, there will be somewhat less service on evenings and weekends than on weekdays. But that is something that we will be gathering input on, whether things should stay that way at the current budget levels. We're also assuming that in the post-pandemic world, there will be some more service at peak hours than is available right now, but not as much as was available pre-pandemic. We're not assuming that service will double at peak hours like it did previously. Last thing before I show you the alternatives. These alternatives are, almost fully designed networks, but they're not perfect. And they're not intended to be perfect. What they're intended to do is to show the extremes of what might be possible if Metro Transit decided to go all the way, as much as possible of the way towards ridership and as much as possible of the way toward coverage, while still incorporating the BRT. So they're extremes. And because they're extremes, they're likely to generate strong reactions for if you disagree mostly with the outcomes of one or another one of those goals. And so these are not proposals, and I want to make that very clear. Neither of them is a proposal. What we're trying to figure out here is which way is the community leaning more in, and what does the community think is wrong with the way we design that alternative so that we can get somewhere in between the two alternatives that will actually be a plan. So here's the existing network overlaid on a map of Madison in general. You can see a bunch of lines on this map in front of you, and you'll notice that these lines are color-coded. And that's very important. I want to take you through this color code. Lines in red are frequent. And what we mean by frequent is that they come every 15 minutes or better all through the day, at least on weekdays, but not just at peaks, all through the day. So those are lines in red, frequent service. In blue, you see lines that typically come every 30 minutes. And then in a lighter blue, you'll see lines that only come once an hour. And then you'll notice that there are also a few other lines, if you squint, that are in this faint gold color. And those lines only come a few times a day, usually only at peak hours. And this color scheme is deliberately chosen because really how visible the color is on this map reflects how obvious it is that there is service and how that service works on the street. When service only comes a few times a day, you may not be aware of it, or you may see a bus stop but never see a bus and have no idea how to use it. So this is the existing service. And I think one thing that is worth pointing out without getting into a detailed analysis of the network is that, first of all, the vast majority of the service comes more or less every 30 minutes, so it's not very frequent, and that the service is organized around downtown, but also around these suburban transfer points, north, south, east, west, and a smaller one, East Town Mall. And what those transfer points mean is that if your trip starts or ends farther out than those transfer points, most of the time, you will have to take a bus that will take you to the transfer point where you'll wait a few minutes and you may have to change buses to keep going on your trip. And that is something that I know has elicited a lot of input over the years and is something that, on the one hand, allows Metro Transit to extend coverage as much as possible, but also causes some inconveniences. So that's the existing network. And now I'm going to show you the ridership network. Here's the existing. Here's the ridership alternative. Existing, ridership, existing, ridership. So looking at the ridership alternative map now, probably the most obvious thing is that there are far fewer lines on this map. What happened to all those bus lines? Well, what happened was the resources invested in a lot of the less frequent bus lines are reinvested into making more lines frequent. There are a lot more red lines on this map, which means that there are large parts of Madison that would have service every 15 minutes or better, not just a couple routes right around the university campus. In addition, there wouldn't be any service only running once an hour. All service would run, all day service would run every 30 minutes or better. We'd try to maintain some coverage to most of the city, even areas that are relatively far out and isolated with some peak only service. And the other thing that's worth noting is that in this very ridership-oriented system, there would no longer be a need for the transfer points because all bus lines would be designed to go from one end of town to another. You could follow any one of these. For example, take this, this D line out here. The D line out in Southwest Madison, well, there are two branches of it. They start in the Southwest, they join, and they meet together, and then there's a bus that keeps going, goes all the way through downtown, goes to Williamson, and then goes all the way out, out east and out north. Every line does some version of this. So that would mean that there would be a lot less need to transfer in general. And there would still be possibilities for transferring. You would just do them at the logical points where the lines meet, not at relatively arbitrary transfer points. So that's the general shape of the ridership alternative. Back to the existing network, and I'm going to show you the coverage network, and you can see how that's different from the existing. So existing network, coverage, existing, coverage, existing, coverage. So on this map, you might notice that, well, most of the lines are still there. They might not go exactly the same places in exactly the same order. And their number may have, their name may have changed a little bit, but most of the lines are still there. And we've maintained coverage in almost all the same places. And in fact, there are one or two places where coverage has been expanded. There would still be frequent service on the east-west BRT and the inner parts of the north-south BRT, but the rest of the network would function a lot like the current network, with service mostly every 30 minutes and opportunities for transfers at the transfer point with the attendant benefits and disadvantages of that system. One thing that I will say is that compared to the existing network, we've tried to make as much as possible of the service in the coverage alternative use two-way routing and avoid one-way splits so that service is more legible and more useful whether you're coming from home or going back home. That's the coverage alternative. So how do we know whether the ridership alternative or the coverage alternative provides any value? We use two measures for that. The first one we call proximity. The second one we call access. Let me talk to you about proximity for a minute. Proximity is really about how many people would be within a quarter-mile walk of a bus stop. Is there service available near you? This is a measure of coverage. So this tells us how well each of those networks might succeed at meeting a coverage goal. Here is how the existing network performs on coverage. About 80% of people are near a quarter mile of a bus stop in existing service in Madison today. We've also looked at this by frequency, and you can see that although 80% of people more or less are near some form of service, only 11% of people in Madison are near a frequent service that comes every 15 minutes or better. In the ridership alternative, the total number of people near transit would go down a little bit, from about 80% to maybe 76% near any service, or really just 67% near a service that's available all day. But the percentage of people near frequent service, of Madison residents near frequent service, would be multiplied almost by 4, going from 11 to 43%. In the coverage alternative, the total percentage of people near service would remain similar to what it is today, and there would be more people near frequent service than today, largely due to BRT, but not as much as in the ridership network. That's how it goes for residents in general. If we want to consider equity, we can look at the outcomes for people of color and people with low incomes. For low-income residents, here's the existing network. Service near over 90% of people, frequent service near about a third of low-income residents in Madison. In ridership, we're still maintaining service near over 80% of low-income people, and 2/3 of low-income people would be near frequent service. In the coverage alternative, we are maintaining some form of service near over 90% of low-income people in Madison, and almost half would be near a frequent service. So both alternatives would have a lot more frequent service, although there would be more in the ridership. And in the coverage alternative, we would maintain almost all of the current coverage. For people of color, the numbers are sort of similar to the population as a whole, about 80% near some service today, and about 15% near frequent service. In the ridership alternative, you'd go down to about 75% near any service, 66% near all-day service, but frequent service going from 15 to 41%. And in the coverage alternative, about, again, 81% of people near some form of service and 29% near frequent service. So that tells us how many people would be near transit, how many people have some sort of insurance against isolation. And also, if you look at frequency, how many people might be near service that's likely to be useful for a lot of trips. But it doesn't actually tell us how useful the service is. To do that, we look at a measure that we call access. And what we mean by access is, imagine where you are right now, how many places could you reach within 45 minutes? Because that's really what tells you, if you can imagine the number of places that transit can take you to in 45 minutes from now, that gives you some idea of how useful transit might be in your life. And to generate high ridership, transit needs to be useful. We measure usually access to jobs, sometimes access to population, and that's not, but mostly jobs. And just to be clear, we do that mostly because data on jobs is pretty good and easily available. But it's not because we think the transit's main purpose is commuting or that you shouldn't use transit for non-job purposes. It's just where the best data is. And I do want to say that this does put a limitation on the analysis, but a whole lot of the other places people need to go are also places of employment. If you think about places you might go to every day, like the store or a hairdresser or a bank or a community center or any number of places, those are also places of employment. So looking at access to jobs helps us have an idea of whether we're generally having access to more useful places. Again, actually, just to be clear, this measure tells us whether people can get more places. It doesn't actually tell us whether people will ride transit or use it to get to those places. That's something that's a lot more complicated and difficult to predict. And frankly, that we don't like to predict because nobody really knows what people will actually do. That depends on a whole bunch of things that might happen on any given day. But we know that to get high ridership, service has to be useful. And I mentioned 45 minutes. We use 45 minutes because that's how long it takes to drive from one end of Madison to another. So if a trip takes more than 45 minutes, it's probably getting kind of onerous. And when we say 45 minutes and we measure it out, I just want everyone to know that we are measuring this for the whole trip, from where you are right now to where you could be, including the amount of time you'd have to walk to your bus stop, wait for the bus, ride the bus, walk to your destination, make any transfers. So here's an example of how that might work. You see this map here, see the little dot right at Allied and Lovell. So if you can imagine yourself right here, the area in the areas that are in gray and dark blue are where you can get to today. The areas in light blue are and dark blue are the areas you could get to in future. And so what this is showing then is that if the ridership alternative were implemented as drawn, which we're not proposing, but it gives you an idea of how that would work, this is how your access in 45 minutes to the city would change by transit from Allied and Lovell. That's how it would be in the ridership network. In the coverage network, you see that there would also be some changes. You can see that this is actually sort of an average-ish situation for the city in terms of how much change would be possible. There is a fairly significant expansion in access in the ridership network, and there is a smaller expansion in coverage. You can see that in the ridership network, there are a few gray areas indicated places where access is actually reduced from Allied and Lovell. And so that's reflecting perhaps a broader point that the ridership alternative would expand access more overall, but you might also have kind of wider swings. Here's another example. And the thing is, we actually did this similar exercise all over the city. And so we'll show you maps of that. So here's the ridership network again, that I showed you a minute ago with all these frequent lines. And here now is how that would change access to jobs in 45 minutes. So you see this map in front of you now. It's got some green, it's got some pink. Green means access to jobs from the area in green gets better. You could access more jobs in 45 minutes under the ridership alternative than you can today. Pink means you could access fewer. And so you can see that the vast majority of areas in Madison would see improved access to jobs under the ridership alternative compared to existing service in 2021. Of course, areas don't go places, people go places. So we've mapped this according to residential locations using census data. So what you see now are dots. Each dot represents 5 people, and we have some idea more or less of where they live based on census data. We don't know this exactly, but this gives you a general idea. And so you can see that the vast majority of people living in Madison would see improvements in how far they could get to by transit and walking in 45 minutes under the ridership alternative. In fact, the average or the median resident in Madison's job access by transit in 45 minutes would more than double. And taking into account equity considerations, we've also mapped this for people of color. Here you have 1 dot for 1 person of color, and you can see that as with the population in general, the vast majority of people of color would benefit from improved job access by transit under the ridership alternative. And a few people would also lose out. Don't want to minimize that here, but the majority of this map is green. That's how it works for ridership, and similar numbers, as you can see, go more than double the job access in 45 minutes for all residents, and same thing for people of color. In the coverage alternative, we also see an average improvement, which is illustrated by this map, where you can see that most areas are in the green, and that means more jobs available by transit in 45 minutes. But it's not as universally true, and you can notice that there's a lot more areas that are shown in pink. And it's not that those areas have lost all service. It's just that those areas are perhaps not served as directly or as conveniently for one reason or another. So, and to be fair, this is an alternative. This isn't a final design. So this isn't to say that if we based service on a coverage alternative, those specific areas would lose out, but it gives you an idea that more areas would lose out under a coverage alternative, although many areas would also gain. And in fact, we would see an average gain in job access for the median Madison resident of almost 40%, plus 38%. And similarly, for people of color, there would also be an average increase of job access by transit in 45 minutes of 40%. You can also see for both of the ridership and the coverage alternative how the percentage changes are lower for people with low incomes. And that's got a lot to do with where people with low incomes are concentrated, and specifically with the student population. There's a huge concentration of low income students in central Madison, and those areas already have the best transit service now. And so although their access may improve slightly in future under either alternative, the changes just wouldn't be as big on average for the whole population of people with low incomes. So to summarize quickly, in the ridership alternative, only 67% of Madison residents would live within a quarter-mile walk of all-day service, but the average Madison resident could access over 112% more jobs within 45 minutes by transit than today. In contrast, in the coverage alternative, we'd maintain about 81% of Madison residents within a quarter-mile walk of a bus stop, but the gains in job access would be significantly lower, about an increase of 38%. From an equity perspective, in both alternatives, people of color and people with low incomes would benefit in similar ways to the population in general. And for people of color, it's not just similar ways, but also at a similar scale, right? So now the questions we're asking the public. We're curious about a few things. We're curious about how each alternative sits with you in general, whether you think either of these would be better than what exists today. We're curious which way you might lean, more towards ridership, more towards coverage, some of the way, all of the way. And if you have a preferred alternative, or if you're leaning more in one direction, we're interested in what's missing or wrong in this alternative. It's not a final design. We're here to hear ideas about how to make it better. And then finally, the last question was one that I hinted at earlier. In designing these alternatives, we assumed that there would continue to be less service in the evenings and weekends. And we didn't assume that because we think that's good. We assumed that because we didn't want to cut service in the middle of the day. But all other things being equal, is service in the evenings and weekends so important that even without new budget, Metro Transit should shift resources to the evenings and weekends, even if that means less service and lower frequencies on weekdays? So we're asking all these questions. We are gathering input on them through various forums, including some focus groups, but also probably most importantly, the online survey, to which we've gathered over 2,000 responses so far, and through this very meeting, if you'd like to comment once I'm done. I want to give you just a quick preview of what we've heard so far in the survey, which is not to say that this is what we will hear in the end, just to give you an idea of what we have been hearing for context. We're hearing that most, but not all, by any measure, respondents seem to think that the ridership alternative might be better for their own purposes than the existing network. And we're hearing a more split opinion on coverage, where, maybe similar numbers of people think it would be better or worse than the existing network. When people are comparing the ridership alternative to the coverage alternative directly, people are leaning mostly in the direction of ridership, but certainly not all the way. Now, we know we haven't heard from everyone who wants to respond so far, and we would really like to hear from more people, and we would like to hear from particularly a broader cross-section of people. So I certainly want to encourage everyone here to respond to the survey, and I want to also encourage you to tell all your people about it. We're at about 2,100 responses right now. We're hoping to get closer to or to exceed the number of responses on our phase 1 survey, which was closer to 3,000. And to get as much representative input as possible from as many different kinds of people, although we do want to hear from everyone, we are also really particularly hoping to get more input from the groups that I've mentioned below, particularly people of color, seniors, people with disabilities, people with low incomes. We value the input from all other kinds of people too. Those are the people that are so far slightly underrepresented in the responses that we have. So how do you get to the survey? You can go to mymetrobus.com/redesign, which is the project website, or you can go directly to this survey link. Again, please tell everyone about it. You can learn more about the project at the project website. And anytime you can also email the project team at metroredesign@cityofmadison.com. The survey closes next Tuesday. Please go as soon as you can and tell all your people to do the same. So what happens next? Well, immediately after this, we'll be taking questions and comments. And then in a couple of weeks, we will be asking the Transportation Planning and Policy Board of the City of Madison what direction we should take for the draft plan. So we're going to be summarizing all the input we've gotten so far, including what we hear tonight, and saying, okay, here's what the public have told us. What should we do? Which alternative should we lean towards? What should we change in it? We'll take that input and we'll develop a draft plan that will be presented to the public early next winter. And then once there's a draft plan out there, we'll go to public input again, ask for your opinions, see what's right, what needs to change, with the goal of having a final plan next spring. So with all that, thank you so much for your patience through this presentation, and be happy to take questions. And Melissa, I'm going to ask you to facilitate the order of questions and comments.
Do that. So we have one question so far from Alder Figueroa Cole.
Thank you. Hey, Daniel, can you please go back to the slides on the image that you had with the ally area and explain again the numbers at the bottom? I didn't follow.
Is it this map here?
Farther back, I think. The one saying when you start talking about the distance and you pinpoint a couple locations. And one was
this map?
This map, yeah.
Thank you. So I did go through this. I did go through this a little bit quickly, so I'll say it again and maybe hopefully be a little bit clearer this time. Mm-hmm. So when you look at this graphic, this pinpoint here is indicating a location. That location is Allied Drive at Lovell. And so you can imagine that, there's someone there. And so what the graph is trying to show you is the difference in where transit can take you today in 45 minutes or less versus where it could take you in future. And so where you see the light blue color at the edges, That's telling you that if the ridership network were implemented, those are places that you can't get to in 45 minutes today from Allied and Level, but you could if the ridership network were implemented. Where you see the darker blue, that's accessible today and would be accessible in the ridership alternative. And where you see gray, those are areas that you can get to in 45 minutes or less today, but you couldn't if the ridership alternative were implemented as currently drawn.
Thank you. I was kind of putting my attention on the numbers below, but so I kind of missed the color coding meaning. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I'm happy to go back through any of these points if any of the questions are about, clarification.
So Michael Gerdakis has his hand up. Go ahead and unmute yourself, Michael.
Michael.
There you
Melissa,
go.
you actually have to
Oh, I do. Okay,
Yep.
sorry. Thank you, Joe.
So my question was, I wanted to say I'm interested in the ridership alternative, but I also was wondering if you guys saw the design by Michael Duffy.
No, I'm not aware of that design.
Well, it was a design showing a possible, in his mind, it was a underground system, but it could also be applied to us.
Yeah, I think I know what you're talking about. It's a fictional subway map that was designed for Madison. The BRT system is actually quite similar to that, if that's what it is. But
Yeah.
if it's something else, perhaps you could. Sorry, go ahead.
Precisely what I was saying.
Okay, yeah. Otherwise, perhaps you could go ahead and send us an email to Metro Redesign at cityofmadison.com if you have the graphic handy. Thank you.
I will do.
Great, thanks a lot.
So right now there are no other hands up. Oops, Mara. Nope, then she went away.
Is that Alder Wahalia or Wahili? Excuse me.
Oh, yes.
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Daniel. I don't know if the question is for you or for the city. When you look at the redesigning the rideship or the metro, I'm wondering what criteria did you look into in terms of District 7? The reason why I say that is the frequency is very, very low, and also the rideship is also very low in District 7. You talked about earlier, there's every quarter mile there's some bus stop, or where people can take the bus, but I don't see, because the District 7 Country Grove area is growing and there is no bus stop there. So I'm wondering, what's the plan for that area?
Okay. Why don't I go back and show the maps of the existing network and the alternatives, and then and I can try to address the substance of your question as I'm doing that. So in general, the data that we're using to try to figure out, where and how much service to put is demographic data from the census and related sources about where people live, where there are more and fewer people, where there are more and fewer people in situations of disadvantage, where there are more and fewer jobs. So if I understand correctly about District 7, and I just looked this up, so forgive me if I'm wrong, it is kind of this outer southwest area around here where I'm pointing with my mouse. And that scenario that, as of now, has a few kind of relatively infrequent routes running every 30 or every 60 minutes that mostly go to the west transfer point. And a lot of that service is one way. So what would happen in the ridership alternative in District 7 is that those services would be replaced by kind of a combination of this. What's been drawn here is the D, E, and the G. And the goal of those is that they are replacing services that require transfers at the west transfer point to services that get you up to BRT in the case of D, and then allow people to connect to the BRT and everywhere that goes, but also go directly downtown. And that would be every half hour. The E does something similar from kind of this area even further south near McKee through Allied Drive and then up towards campus and downtown. And the G is this sort of beltline route that would go all around kind of the peripheral areas of Madison, trying to hit as many job centers as possible. So that's kind of what would be proposed in the ridership alternative. In the coverage alternative, you would have more routes than are available right now in that particular district. But they would, like existing service, be oriented towards these transfer points, and some of them would only run once an hour. So the decisions that are made around any particular district, just to be clear, aren't necessarily about that district or or really at all about the type of people that live there. That's one of the inputs. The other inputs is really where is it and how easy is it to run a bus to there and through there. And so we use both of those. And, we try to get service close to, in the coverage alternative, as many people as possible all over the city. And in the ridership alternative, we were less focused on getting close to as many people as possible and more focused on making that service, connect to as many places as quickly as possible. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
So we have two questions. Mara Ike, I hope I said that correctly. Joe, can you unmute her?
Thank you, Melissa. I did post one question in the chat that I'm hearing from transportation goals that a decrease in vehicles on the streets is a goal. Which alternative decreases the number of vehicles during working hours and also during evening hours when entertainment and going out to eat is occurring? But I'm also curious, we've mapped this out by jobs and diversity, color, and low income. What does it look like when we map it out for access to older adults and those disabled? Thank you. Thank you.
So to answer your first question, the one from the chat, I think that, what reduces vehicles on the road most is correlated to what causes the highest possible ridership. And that's, useful, frequent service and direct service. And so I think that the ridership alternative would be closer to that particular goal. To your second question about seniors and how they would be impacted by either alternative. I don't have the map in this presentation, but I do know from the work we've done previously that seniors tend to be they're more likely to live in outlying areas, and they're more generally dispersed around the city and less concentrated in the center than the general population. So in terms of coverage to seniors, I think the coverage alternative would probably provide more. I think I can't speak to what that means for any individual senior. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Next, we have Carly Forsyth.
Hi there. Hopefully this is functioning. I have one question that somewhat dovetails with the previous speaker's question. Wondering, and I may have missed this, I've had to be hopping in and out as the evening has gone on, but is there a strictly text-based is there something that is a strictly text-based presentation of the ridership alternative and the coverage alternative rather than, something being pointed to in with a mouse on a screen for anyone who may not be able to access it? That would really very much be appreciated rather than a PDF that relies completely on visuals. Does such a thing exist?
So thank you for asking that question. So this, the presentation I've been showing tonight is a sort of a summary of the alternatives report, which is on the website. And that report is a PDF with alt text throughout for all the graphics. I'm not going to say that it provides a full detailed turn-by-turn description of each possible route, but it does provide as much as possible a description of what's being proposed and what the impacts are, and everything that's in graphics is described.
And I'm going to put that in the chat right now. That'll take you right there to that report.
I did see the report earlier. I did see that the PDFs were up there. I do wonder, will a more thoroughly detailed description be available before anything like a decision is being made? Because that does, I'm sorry to say, it would cut out access for a number of people who would otherwise, not be able to see for one reason or another, not be able to see the graphics, or would need, the further information, the full and detailed information before making an informed decision.
I will note that this presentation will be posted on the website so people can go back and watch it at their leisure. And that's one of the benefits of having gone virtual is the ability for all of these to be recorded, including all of the chat and everything else. So, so I've just posted the report in here. For those of you who would like to go and review that, it's quite a document.
Just also like to add, if there's a way that we can help disseminate that information in the meantime, feel free to, the best way to get into contact with us is to email us at metroredesign@cityofmadison.com. If there's any way we can help describe the maps or anything, we'd be happy to do that. Get in touch with you.
Diane Morgenthaler. Hi, Diane. That's the next question.
Diane is muted.
Yeah, Diane, you have to unmute yourself. You're able to do that now.
No, thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for this presentation today. It's been really enlightening. I think the thing that comes to mind is today, where is the ridership today and how does that flow into these two different proposals? Because it seems like there's an opportunity to build ridership, which is a mindset change among our citizenry. So how does today's ridership flow into these two models?
So we looked at existing ridership, both ridership that's, in 2020 and in 2019, in designing both of these alternatives. I will say that ridership today is highly disrupted by the pandemic and the very specific conditions that are going on. And in terms of how that differs from before the pandemic, it's kind of similar to what's been going on everywhere else. For the most part, ridership is down a whole lot. But ridership from people who really need the service has held up a lot more. And by really need, I don't mean everyone doesn't need it. I mean people who are disadvantaged, people who are more likely to be low-income people or people of color or hold low-paid essential worker jobs. That ridership has held up a lot more. And so, we did investigate all of that in the choices report, and we did, when we drew these alternatives, we actually used maps that as one of the possible backgrounds on them was all of the ridership data that we have right now. So we were aware of that. And the coverage network specifically, every once in a while you made a decision about, well, should the bus go left or right here? Well, maybe if we go left, we get within a quarter mile of more people, but maybe there are 10 existing riders at this bus stop if we go right. So we're always weighing that. But Justin, why don't you tell us more?
Yeah, I just wanted to note, as Daniel mentioned, throughout the pandemic, we've experienced quite a bit of a ridership reduction. However, September has really turned a corner. We don't know exactly what that ridership looks like until we get to the end of the month and really pull that data. But through the summer, this past summer, we were about 50% of normal levels, 2019 levels. So far in September, after UW has fully reopened, we are much closer to normal 2019 levels. I don't think we're all the way there, but if I had to guess, we're probably more in the 80 to 90% of normal range. So things have really turned a corner just in the last couple of weeks.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that information.
Ben, you had something?
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to also mention the MPO and the city of Madison have a subscription to this big data platform called Streetlight, where they use location-based services on people's smartphones. So when you have your Starbucks app going in the background, your phone is sending information about where it is. And this big company, Streetlight, takes that number, anonymizes it, and then we purchase that data. And so we actually looked at both overall trip origins and destinations throughout the metro service area, as well as trips that are already by transit. And so all of that data also was another backdrop that all of this was based on, that we provided to Jarrett Walker and their team. And so, we're sort of the other side of ridership. One is how many people are on the bus, and then the other side is where are they getting on, where are they getting off, even if they have to make 2 transfers along the way. So we were looking at that as well. And I just wanted to make sure that everyone was aware of that.
There were a handful of questions in the chat. If I could just go ahead at this point and address those quickly. One was, is the survey that's out now the same as the survey that was out several months ago? This is the second survey. So if you took a survey a few months ago, go ahead and take this one again. It is different. It talks more about the choice of ridership and coverage. And then the other question in the chat was about reaching out to people without technology. We have done a variety of strategies to reach out to people in different ways. We've surveyed some people at the transfer points. We've reached out to people in small groups. It is true that not everybody has access to technology, but actually what we're finding is that from a representation standpoint, we're getting more representative response from people using things like the online survey because it's relatively easy to do. It only takes a couple of minutes rather than going to meetings and so forth. So the answer is yes, we are. But I think that the online survey has been pretty successful for us as well.
So we have 2 more questions that have just popped up in the chat, but Mara has had her hand up for a while.
Thank you. When I was working about 2016 to 2019, I took the bus from the west side to MATC. And then I would come home from work and I would get in my car and either go out to dinner or go to the Overture downtown. And I'm thinking if the city is looking at decreasing the vehicles on the street, we're going to have to look at an increase in service in the evening, and that's going to cost us more. I just feel like we have to have an acceptance that we're going to have to invest some money if we really want to get these vehicles off the street. Do you see that there will be an increase in evening service and it will allow people to get to and from restaurants, State Street, Overture, Coliseum, places like that?
Certainly, I can say the alternatives weren't designed with the assumption that those funds would be available. We assume that right now we're trying to get to a plan that can be implemented, in the next couple of years. And we're assuming that what's available are the resources that the city has dedicated to this so far. I think, as a consultant, I'm not really entitled to an opinion on whether the city should fund service more to get more evening service, but that's certainly something that you could express to the city if you think that's important.
Thank you.
Tom has just raised his hand.
Yeah, the state has some fiscal constraints on what the city can do with its operating budget. They kind of put a cap on what they can allocate for operating costs. And every year it becomes more difficult because, you know, our costs always increase, right? Through wages and gas, and the cost of tires. And yet the tax revenues don't increase at the same rate. So every year the city is faced with really excruciating choices regarding whether or not to fund ambulance crews or additional, service workers. And so I think, we will continue to pursue alternate funding sources for transit. But I just want you to know that because of the state legislation and our fiscal environment, it's actually more difficult than you would anticipate to just say, oh, we're going to increase transit funding. Because really what it means is that we have to take it away from some other city service that's really also very crucial, and so I just want to lay that as a background, because I think we all want more transit. I'm, as the director of transportation, I want more transit service, but the city has to make difficult choices amongst a limited amount that they can allocate towards all these crucial services. Thank you.
So I think Emma has a question. I think this was directed towards you, Ben. When was the origin destination study conducted, and is it available to the public?
Well, to answer the second part first, yes, absolutely. We're a public agency, and we, aside from a few contracts, everything that we have is public. That said, I seriously doubt if any sane member of the public wants that data. They are volumes of GIS data and spreadsheets. It's nothing that there's no formal report. We have millions of bits of data that we can look at and aggregate and kind of say, okay, from this area, people are going to this area at this time of day. And we can fiddle with those things and look at it as we're designing a system or an alternative system. But there isn't a formal report that I can hand you. That said, I can certainly zip the GIS files and the Excel spreadsheets and share them with you if you have the capacity to do anything with that. But it is it's a lot of data and not a concise report. And I guess I should also just say it was based on 2019 data. Was what I did that analysis on. Obviously 2020 data is going to be skewed. We have pandemic and a lot of everything just getting turned upside down. And so we did that based on the most recent real full system operation with full ridership. And we'll be continuing to use that tool to evaluate the system as we move forward.
Thanks, Ben. Darren asks, will population growth tied to exact scientists and EPIC system employees play a role in a bus coverage in District 7?
The short answer is yes, although it sort of, but I guess I would defer to the city and Metro Transit about where that growth is happening and how much it is happening and what that means in detail.
Yeah, so it's a good question. All these data points kind of lead to small decisions around where routes should go. I'll start with EPIC because that's a fairly easy one. EPIC, as you probably know, is headquartered in Verona. They fund the service that serves them It is not funded by the city of Madison, and so those service hours are not under control. And so essentially, we will provide as much service as they're willing to fund, so long as we have the drivers and buses available to operate it. Exact Sciences and other employers, we have kind of mental dots of all over the city. Each has has a unique story about how many employees work there, what its hours are and things like that. So that all factors into how we design the service. Usually we have a pretty good understanding of when large changes like that are being contemplated, because we work closely with our colleagues at the planning department and so forth. So we have a pretty good understanding of when those changes are coming, and we react if we can.
So I got a response from Mara. Thank you, Tom. It makes it even more important for our Transportation Commission Committee to see beyond bicycles as options to alleviate vehicle use. Is that a feasible goal if we are restricted in offering evening and weekend bus services? The alternative to driving downtown for a show is to stay home. Many of us cannot ride a bike tonight for a show. And then Mara says, I think that the network redesign is moving towards more consistent all-day service and away from the peak-oriented service we have today. That will be especially true for those in reach of BRT. And yes, I can promote Alder Heck. No, I can't. You have to do that, Joe. Can you promote Alder Heck and Alder Verveer, two panelists?
So on the point about the network redesign moving toward more consistent all-day service and away from peak-oriented service we have today, that's certainly the premise that we've been working on so far. On the evening and weekend bus service point, I mean, I think I can say that, as a transit professional, I certainly share your opinion that having good and consistent evening and weekend service that doesn't drop completely off from what's available during the day on weekdays is an important part in building your system in the long run. Whether that's feasible, I'll leave to the city.
Justin, did you want to?
Yeah, and so I'd go back to one of the bullets that Daniel had on a slide earlier, is that, that's one of the key pieces of feedback that we're looking for from all of you, is, should we be moving some service from the peak to the evening and weekend? Ultimately within the scope of this study, we're kind of limited within a budget. And so it's not just a question of adding more money to serve the weekend and evening. But certainly if you all feel that weekend and evening service improvements are highly critical, that's something that I encourage you to state explicitly, and so that we can record that as public feedback. And then one other note, I think on one of the questions about growth in other areas. So one important thing to note, this is a network that we're planning to implement over the next 2 years. And so largely we've considered existing population and jobs, and in some cases, development that's planned, but, is in the final stages, basically approved developments that are almost under construction. We have not given much weight to, development that might be 5 or 10 years out at this point. That's something we'll have to address in kind of future iterations of the network. But ultimately, we don't think it's the best use of our resources to provide good service to areas that aren't actually built out right now, because there's plenty of areas that are built out right now that need good service.
And I'll add 2 quick points to that before Ben speaks. Just based on the input we've received so far, which again is preliminary, so I'm not saying it's what we've heard for sure, but what we've seen so far in the survey responses on those 2 points are in terms of that people are no, I don't think that basically we're getting almost half of people saying that there should not be reductions in weekday service to pay for more evening and weekend service. And only 20% of people so far saying that there should be. So that's the preliminary input, is that we probably shouldn't move in that direction at the existing available operating budgets. And then on the service out to new development, what we've heard so far is that that's really pretty much the bottom priority of the people answering the surveys, at least. Service out to new development at the edges of the city. There's a lot of other things that people are putting ahead of that. Ben?
Thank you, Daniel. Yeah, I just wanted to say that, for this project and for Metro's planning in general, Metro's dealing with, buses that are at capacity and needing to get an extra bus out there, and dealing with the day-to-day operations of a sick driver or a vehicle that needs maintenance. And so this kind of planning, where we're dealing with network changes that are huge and comprehensive and very important, as Daniel has said, we're looking at the next 2 years for implementing this. The MPO partners with Metro, and we're involved in this project, not so much because I can add anything to the expertise of JWA and Metro in this short range, but the MPO works with Metro to design service guidelines and service parameters for when service is increased or when service is decreased, when service goes to a new neighborhood, and in helping to establish those longer term goals and sort of guidelines. And so that's something that once we finish this process and we have this network ready to go, then I will start working with the goals that we heard from the community through this process to update those service planning guidelines so that after this network is fully operational and BRT is fully operational in 2024, we're able to help Metro respond to those changes proactively in the future, and that they have a very transparent and publicly vetted sort of rule book for when a new bus needs to get added to an area, or when service is not being productive enough. There aren't enough people on the bus to justify the public resources that go into operating that vehicle there, and we want to relocate that resource somewhere else. So that's really outside the bailiwick of this particular project, but it is something that we all consider very much, and that's where the MPO gets a lot more involved in trying to support Metro in those longer range decisions. So again, it's not that we're not considering it, it's that it's beyond the 2-year planning horizon of this particular project. And if you're more concerned about those long range things, I'd encourage you to check out the MPO webpage on the regional transportation plan, which are going to set those longer range goals for the whole region, and the commuter rail to Stoughton and to DeForest and those sorts of things that are beyond the scope of this project.
So we've got a couple of comments in the chat. Diane says, let's not forget about weekend and evening service for hospitality employees. And then Darren says, thanks for the response to my question. There has been ongoing growth on McKee Road and Maple Grove, especially by Chavez School. And I am not seeing any other hands up. We still have a few more minutes. If anyone has a question or comment they'd like to share? While you all are contemplating remaining questions, I wanted to let you know that from the time that we sent you those numbers, Daniel, we are now up to over 2,200 survey respondents. So there's been a lot of activity on the survey, which is great, and I think that we are gonna exceed the first survey.
Great.
All right, well, thanks. One last call for questions. If you have a question or comment, now's the time. Not seeing any pop up here. Thanks everybody for joining us. And again, I'd like you to invite you to engage with us by visiting our website, mymetrobus.com/redesign. Email us at metroredesign@cityofmadison.com, and go ahead and take that survey. That link there is the direct link to the survey, or you can go to the website below, and then there's a link there as well. So either way, you'll get there one way or the other. And it's getting late, so thanks for your time and have a good evening.